The dawn sky above Magdeburg was brittle and pale, the kind of winter light that turned the frost to steel. On the runway of JG-7, the Luftwaffe's first jet squadron, mechanics pulled chocks from the wheels of the Messerschmitt Me-262s, silver-gray arrows glinting under a low sun. Inside the cockpits, young pilots adjusted their oxygen masks and grinned with quiet confidence. Nothing the Allies had could touch them now. At nearly 550 miles per hour, their jets could climb through flak and vanish before the next salvo reached altitude. Conventional shells exploded behind them, far too slow, far too late. They throttled forward. The runways blurred. One after another, the 262s leapt into the frozen air, forming a loose wedge toward a high-altitude formation of American B-17s lumbering home from Berlin. But as they closed within range, something changed. The bursts ahead didn't trail behind this time. They appeared in front of the jets, hanging in mid-air, timed to an unseen rhythm. Flashes rippled like invisible fences across their path. The first Me-262 flew straight into it and vanished in a sphere of fire. The rest scattered, stunned. The flak had learned to think. By late 1944, the Me-262 was the most feared aircraft in the world. It could fly 100 miles an hour faster than any Allied fighter, climb beyond interception, and dive away from pursuit with impunity. The jet age had arrived, too late to save Germany, but just in time to terrify everyone trying to end the war. Allied bomber crews called it the Ghost. It appeared out of the sun, fired a burst of 30mm shells, and disappeared before gunners could even swing their turrets. No one could track it. Not radar predictors, not optical sights, not even the fastest trigger, fingers of the flak batteries ringing Europe's rail yards and bridges. The standard Allied anti-aircraft method in 1944 relied on time fuses, mechanical, devices set by hand before firing, calibrated to explode at an estimated altitude. They worked against predictable, slow targets, propeller-driven bombers flying in formation. But a jet traveling at over 500 miles could traverse an entire flak pattern before the shells even reached detonation height. By the time a German Me-262 streaked through a bomber stream, the bursts were still rising behind it. For the first time since 1940, Allied air defense officers admitted something alarming. They could no longer rely on reaction. Technology had outpaced timing. The American search for an answer across the Atlantic. Scientists at the National Defense Research Committee and the Bureau of Ordnance had been working on a secret project since 1940, something once dismissed as impossible. They wanted a fuse that could know when it was near a target. No dials, no guesses, just proximity. The idea had come from radar itself. If radio waves could detect aircraft from miles away, why couldn't a miniature radar inside a shell detect one from yards away? The challenge was absurd. Fit an entire transmitter, receiver, amplifier, battery, and switch inside a steel casing that would be fired from a cannon. Survive 20,000 G of acceleration, spin at 20,000 RPM, and still function flawlessly. Yet, at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, a handful of physicists believed it could be done. Under the codename VT, for variable time, they spent 4 years designing vacuum tubes the size of a thimble and circuits that could listen for radio echoes off nearby metal. When the signal returned strong enough, the fuse detonated automatically. No timing, no guesswork. By 1944, the weapon existed. By 1945, it was perfect. The first proof, the Pacific. Before the VT fuse reached Europe, it had already changed the war at sea. American destroyers in the Philippines used it to stop kamikaze attacks, shells exploding near incoming aircraft rather than after them. Fleet gunners reported that their kill rates tripled overnight. Where once 10 shells were needed for one hit, now 1 or 2 were enough. It was only a matter of time before the Army asked for it too. The 90mm anti-aircraft gun, the workhorse of U.S. flak batteries defending Antwerp and the Ruhr, was powerful but blind. With the new fuse, it could become something else entirely, a predictive weapon, not a reactive one. In December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge raged, trainloads of VT-fused shells began crossing the channel. They arrived under guard, stamped top secret, handle with care. Each round contained a sensor so advanced that even the men firing it didn't understand how it worked. They only knew that the shell would now decide for itself when to detonate. The first German jets appeared over the Rhine just weeks later. To the radar operators of the 8AA command, they looked like streaks of lightning, too fast for normal calibration. But the new shells didn't need calibration. They just had to be fired in the right direction. The stage was set for a duel of extremes, speed versus signal, muscle versus mathematics. And in that contest, the Me-262's advantage in velocity was about to disappear into a storm of bursts it could neither see nor outfly. The first shipments of VT-fused 90mm shells reached Europe under near-total secrecy. Only a handful of officers even knew what the initials VT meant. To the gunners themselves, they were simply new rounds, strange, heavier, sealed in waxed cartons marked Property of U.S. Navy Ordnance Division. Before issuing them to combat batteries, the Army ran a controlled field test in southern England in November 1944. A captured German Focke-Wulf 190, flown by a British pilot, was sent down a measured path across a live anti-aircraft range. When the 90mm guns opened fire, something unprecedented happened. The first shells detonated within yards of the target. No manual timing, no visible miss. On the second pass, a near burst shredded the plane's tail, forcing an emergency landing. One observer wrote simply, "Accuracy beyond comprehension." That test convinced Allied command that the weapon was ready. By December, as the Luftwaffe unleashed its desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes, General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group authorized limited frontline use. The 90mm batteries around Liège, Namur, and Antwerp, targets of constant V1 and jet attacks, were chosen first. The men who loaded those guns had no idea they were holding a technological revolution in their hands. The fuses were handled like explosives, their noses sheathed in protective caps. Each gun position received new firing instructions. Do not set fuse. Fire normally. It felt wrong, like skipping a step that had been drilled into muscle memory for years, but the results erased all doubt. The first night the VT rounds were used, gunners at Liège brought down 3 V1 flying bombs with just 9 shells. The next day, they shot a Ju 188 from the sky with a single burst. The difference was instantaneous and devastating. In January 1945, as the Allied armies broke through the Ardennes and rolled toward the Rhine, the new ammunition followed. Each 808 group received small consignments, often guarded by military police. Crews were warned, if captured, destroy all VT shells immediately. To lose one to German intelligence would reveal too much, and too soon. By February, the 90mm guns of the 1st and 9th Armies were fully stocked. Their operators, veterans who had fired tens of thousands of rounds in defense of Antwerp and Brussels, now watched, with growing astonishment, as their radar screens began showing new kinds of contacts, fast, small, metallic, traveling too high for piston. Engines the Me-262 had entered their theater. For the Luftwaffe, these jet missions were meant to be symbolic, proof that Germany could still strike. The pilots flew from fields at Parchim, Rheine, and Akmer, diving on bomber streams or bridgeheads before American escorts could respond. Their attacks were surgical and brief, but each one chipped away at Allied morale. Every crew shot down by a jet sent a ripple of fear through the bomber force until the VT guns opened up. By early 1945, Allied air defense had evolved into a kind of orchestra. The British SCR-584 radar tracked incoming aircraft. The M9 director predicted trajectories. The 90mm guns aligned automatically through servo motors. It was a mechanical miracle, but still limited by human reaction time. Now, with the VT fuse, the loop was complete. The radar found the target, the predictor sent the angle, the gunners fired, and the shells themselves determined the instant of detonation. The entire sequence from detection to destruction took less than a minute. What the Germans saw from above was nothing short of witchcraft. Jets diving at 500 mm suddenly met walls of perfectly spaced explosions, every burst centered around their flight path, not behind it. To the pilots, it seemed the Americans had learned to anticipate the future. Reports began trickling into Luftwaffe. High command from returning crews: flak bursts detonate too close, too accurate, impossible timing. Within weeks, rumors spread among German units that the Americans had invented intelligent shells. They were right. The Me-262's era of invulnerability was ending, not from another fighter, but from a mathematics equation sealed inside a steel casing. The idea behind the VT fuse sounded like science fiction even to the scientists building it. Each 90mm shell contained a miniature radar transmitter that emitted a stream of radio pulses as it flew. If those waves bounced off a nearby object, an aircraft, a wing, a metal skin, the reflected energy triggered an electrical circuit inside the fuse, setting off the explosive at the perfect instant. It was radar, inverted and weaponized. The shell didn't need to hit a target. It only had to sense that one was near. To achieve this, physicists at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory spent years shrinking components that once filled entire rooms into a space smaller than a fist. They designed vacuum tubes that could survive the shock of being fired at 2,700 feet per second. They invented tiny mercury batteries that could power the device for just long enough to reach altitude. They invented tiny mercury batteries that could power the device for the few seconds of flight that mattered. They encased the whole assembly in a shock-proof mount that insulated delicate circuitry from the 20,000+ G of muzzle acceleration. Engineers tested and retested, firing dummy rounds down long rails, instrumenting the fuses with strain gauges, then finally sending them skyward against towed targets. Each success answered a single stubborn question: could a shell decide when to die? The answer came back in a brilliant orange flash over a test range: yes. For anti-aircraft crews, the VT fuse dissolved a lifetime of habit. Gunners who had spent years learning to estimate altitude, set fuse timing, and pray for a near miss suddenly found the human variable removed. Training sheets were reprinted. No fuse setting required. A short sentence that changed everything. Imagine a battery of 90mm guns on a cold rise hill outside Antwerp. The predictor operators dial in speed and vector, the directors feed angles to the guns, and the first rounds lift in a precise wave. Where previously bursts rose and fell like delayed fireworks, now detonations threaded the attack corridor like a string of pearls, each explosion forming an invisible curtain at the flight level of the approaching aircraft. Gunners observed that the cone of lethal fragments had become denser and far more reliable. A single controlled burst now could shred aircraft control surfaces rather than merely pepper paint. The psychological effect on crews was immediate. Veterans who had once cursed misfires and late explosions began reporting an almost clinical calm in action. The line of fire no longer required frantic adjustments. The war room's job was to find the target and point the batteries. The ammunition had become the last decisive brains in the chain. For Luftwaffe pilots, the VT fuse introduced a new kind of dread. The Me-262's whole survival doctrine rested on closing fast, delivering a brief burst and exiting the formation before the flak trajectory matured. Now, accounts from German pilots read like fragments of disbelief. They spoke of bursts that waited, explosions that seemed to bloom precisely where their wings had been a heartbeat earlier. Me-262 pilot described an intercept over the Ruhr. He rolled through a bomber stream at 480 to 520 Mach, confident the flak would be behind him. Instead, there were pops in front of me, each one closer than the last. And then my elevator snagged and the jet spun, gone in an instant. Survivors told of control rods cut by fragments or tailplanes splintered by shrapnel, not by cannon fire. The rocket-age kills, blazing, obvious, were replaced by the merciless arithmetic of fragmentation delivered at the perfect time. Commando reports began to change tone. Where pilots had once boasted of speed, they now recorded the odd timing of losses and recommended lower exposure times over targets. Morale among jet units sagged. The invulnerability of velocity had been punctured, and the sky felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. VT fuses did not operate in isolation. They required a system, an orchestra that combined detection, prediction, and now an intelligent munition. The battlefield deployed three main elements in tight choreography. Detection. SCR-584 and other search radars found inbound formations, giving accurate azimuth and elevation. Prediction. Electromechanical directors, like the M9, calculated future positions based on speed and vector, driving servo motors that aimed the 90 mm tubes. Action. The guns fired normal ballistic trajectories. The VT fuse handled the last meter, the split second of decision. The result was a closed-loop system with one astonishing property. It eliminated the need for perfect prediction. Predictors still reduced the problem space, aiming the guns into a useful corridor, but the fuse corrected the final uncertainty. The battery's role shifted from timing explosions to producing well-formed, dense salvos. Crews learned to trust that the ammunition would finish what the director began. This integration also allowed more flexible defensive postures. Batteries could be sited to create layered envelopes over critical points: bridges, rail junctions, bomber assembly zones. A single engagement could involve multiple batteries firing coordinated salvos. VT detonations would overlap and interlock, producing lethal volumes of airburst at jet altitudes. The jet pilot, trying to thread between curtains of explosions, found few safe corridors. Manufacture of VT fuses was an industrial feat wrapped in secrecy. Production lines at firms like Westinghouse and small ordnance plants turned out millions of fuse under strict control. Each fuse's tinplate case hid delicate electronics. Quality control was ruthless because a single failure could mean the loss of a gunner's life through premature detonation. Logistics also mattered. VT rounds were shipped under guard, stored separately from conventional ammunition, and issued only to selected AAA battalions. Manuals warned crews, if captured, destroy immediately. The Allied command understood that German analysis of one intact fuse could accelerate countermeasures. Despite the risk, distribution was rapid. By early 1945, tens of thousands of VT-fused 90mm shells were in European batteries. The speed of deployment mattered as much as the technology. The psychological shock required the sudden, almost theatrical appearance of a capability the enemy could not comprehend in time to respond. The VT fuse's physics, its seamless integration into radar-directed batteries, the speed of its production and clandestine deployment, these angles together explain how a single innovation transformed air defense. It didn't merely increase kill rates, it rewired expectations about what ordnance could do. The morning was clear and hard as glass. The bomber streams moving east over the Rhine glinted like slow rivers of aluminum. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s stacked in tight formation. Beneath them, on ridges outside Essen, the barrels of 90mm M1 guns tilted upward in perfect synchronization. Radar scopes hummed. Directors whirred. The batteries of the U.S. 9th Air Force waited for a sound they'd learned to recognize, the distant whine that wasn't a propeller. At 10:16 a.m., radar picked up fast blips, Me-262s closing from 25 miles. Operators called corrections. Crews swung the barrels. The fire order crackled through headsets. VT load, rapid. 6 guns fired as one. The first shells climbed, silent, invisible. Then, halfway to the bombers, the air itself detonated. Bursts appeared not behind the jets, but ahead of them, prearranged by circuitry too quick for human hands. The German formation flew straight into its own future. Pilots saw the sky erupt in geometric rows of orange. One 262 vanished instantly, its left wing severed. Another rolled inverted, streaming fire and disintegrated before the pilot could eject. Within 20 seconds, 3 aircraft were gone. Survivors pulled out and dove for cloud cover, pursued not by shells but by mathematics. From the ground, the engagement looked unreal, precision without warning. The gun crews never saw the jets. They only heard the reports come in later. A battery commander at Dinslaken logged the action in one line. Fired 54 rounds, observed 4 detonations, probable 3 kills. Through the spring, these events repeated like ritual. Every time the jets appeared, the air defenses reacted with a new rhythm, coordinated, confident, mechanical. Allied radar could now cue guns hundreds of yards apart to fire in overlapping grids. The VT fuses turned each grid into a field of timed energy, a 3-dimensional minefield that existed only for a heartbeat and yet covered entire flight corridors. German reconnaissance photographed bomber routes afterward and found nothing to explain it. No new weapon, no visible change in flak patterns. But their losses told the truth. The Luftwaffe's final miracle plane was dying faster than it could fly. Even the famous Gallen's Jagdverband 44, the elite unit of jet aces, lost aircraft to what pilots called blind flak. They tried to alter attack angles, diving from the sun, skimming through valleys, but the burst seemed to predict them. One ace wrote bitterly in his diary, "We were not shot down. We were calculated down." By April 1945, Allied intelligence recorded that Me-262 sorties had dropped by half. The jets that reached targets rarely returned. Fuel shortages played a role, but the decisive factor was fear. Crews no longer trusted the sky above Allied lines. Even a few seconds of exposure invited annihilation. Meanwhile, American gunners, many unaware of the secret inside their shells, noticed morale soaring. Veteran crews who had once called flak blind thunder now spoke of it with something like pride. They began to count detonations, to call out hits with confidence. Some gave their batteries nicknames: Skytrap, Phantom Fence, The Wall. At night, when the gun positions cooled and the radar screens dimmed, the operators traded rumors that the Germans believed the Americans had invented magnetic air, or that captured pilots had described self-steering bullets. None of them were far from the truth. What the pilots saw, from the cockpit of a surviving Me-262, the view of a VT barrage was unforgettable. Veteran pilot Georg Popp later recalled flying through it over Ham. "You saw flashes, but no shell trails. Just sudden fire, like the sky breaking into pieces. There was no warning. One second you were alone, the next there were explosions in every direction. It felt like flying into glass that had shattered around you. Fragments from a single 90mm VT burst could tear through aluminum 100 feet away. Against a jet with thin wings and pressurized fuel lines, even a near miss was fatal. The Me-262's speed, once its armor, had become its liability. The faster it flew, the more likely it was to enter a fresh field of fused bursts before the fragments dispersed. In less than 2 months, the Luftwaffe's last technological hope had been neutralized, not by faster planes, but by smarter shells. End of the jet threat by May 1945, Anti-Aircraft Command estimated that 90% of all German aircraft losses within Allied sectors came from VT-fused fire. The Me-262, the symbol of a future war, had been erased by an invisible present. As Germany collapsed, Allied analysts noted the irony. Radar, the technology that had once made aircraft safer, had now been packed into bullets to destroy them. The sky over the Ruhr grew quiet. Radar screens that had once danced with targets now showed nothing but weather. Gun crews stood down, exhausted, half aware they had just witnessed the last great evolution of the war, the moment when physics itself had become a weapon. As the Allies surged across the Rhine, the Luftwaffe's surviving jets were concentrated around Munich, Augsburg, and Regensburg, the last functioning bases with enough concrete and fuel to sustain operations. These airfields were symbols now, defiant outposts of a crumbling empire. Every takeoff risked annihilation. Every landing was a gamble. The American 15th Anti-Aircraft Command, however, was already waiting. Along the advancing front, engineers set up mobile 90mm batteries in leapfrog fashion, pairing radar trucks with flatbed gun mounts so that fire could follow the troops. The system was called rolling flak, and with VT fuses, it was faster than the Luftwaffe's reaction time. At dawn on April 9th, radar units near Nuremberg detected high-speed contacts. 8 Me-260Ws of JG-7 were inbound, hunting for bridges and supply convoys. Their attack profile was standard: descend from 25,000 feet, release 30mm fire in one pass, then escape west. But as they entered range, the sky bloomed before them. Rows of detonations suspended as if frozen in air. The Germans had never seen anything like it. Their tactics depended on anticipation, reading the intervals of conventional flak, predicting gaps between bursts. But the new American barrages had no rhythm, no pattern. The shells exploded in irregular yet precise clusters, forming what appeared to be living walls. 3 jets disintegrated within seconds. 2 more aborted, diving at near supersonic speed to escape. The survivors barely reached base. Post-action reports were grim. Enemy flak timed by radar, perfectly adjusted at all heights. It wasn't radar timing anymore. It was radar thinking. A web around the bridges by mid-April, the Allies' Rhine crossings at Wesel, Remagen, and Mainz were lifelines. Tens of thousands of vehicles, fuel trucks, and infantry columns moved across them every day. The Luftwaffe threw what remained of its air power at these bridges, desperate to delay the advance. For every attack, the same story repeated. Jets appeared, dove, and vanished into self-triggered infernos. Each bridge was guarded by concentric rings of radar-guided 90mm guns, firing VT ammunition pre-programmed into altitude bands. The effect was almost theatrical, like invisible domes of steel and sound rising over the river. Observers on the ground described the scene as controlled. Lightning! The air itself seemed to explode in sequences of synchronized fire, yet there was no guessing, no overshoot, no gap. The Germans later learned why. Each gun crew had been trained to overlap fuse sensitivity zones, ensuring that if one shell failed to detect a target, the next would compensate automatically. The result was absolute denial. No German aircraft, jet or otherwise, managed a successful strike against the Rhine crossings after mid-April. One American officer wrote, "We built our bridges under fire, and we held them under silence." The VT made sure of that. The fall of the jet bases. As the ground war reached Bavaria, the VT weapon reached its cruelest efficiency. At Augsburg, batteries from the U.S. 7th Army covered the retreating columns from air raids. When reconnaissance detected Me-262s assembling for a final sortie, radar trucks triangulated their approach paths and fired blind into the overcast. Minutes later, debris rained across farm fields. Prisoners, taken afterward, were stunned. One captured German ground officer admitted, "We could not understand why the bursts were perfect every time. Even when our altitude changed, the flak followed. We thought the Americans had found our frequencies." He wasn't wrong to suspect that level of precision. In a way, the Americans had tuned into the Luftwaffe, not through intercepted radio, but through the electromagnetic logic of the VT fuse. It was the same language the radar stations spoke, now condensed into a steel shell. The end of the Luftwaffe's faith in technology. Perhaps the cruelest irony of the war's closing months was that both sides had placed their faith in machines. Germany's miracle was the Me-262, elegant, fast, revolutionary, but fragile and few. America's miracle was the VT fuse, invisible, simple, anonymous, yet mass-produced by the millions. In those final weeks, the difference became clear. Technology was not only invention, it was organization. The Allies had built a system that connected radar, data, production, and logistics into a seamless machine. The Luftwaffe, brilliant but isolated, could never match it. Historians would later write that the proximity fuse was second only to the atomic bomb in shortening the war. But for the men on the ground, it was more personal. They saw it as proof that the battlefield itself had begun to think, that the margin between life and death was now calculated by circuits instead of luck. Last skies over Germany on April the 26th, with the Reich collapsing, a handful of Me-262s rose from Riem airfield for one last mission. The pilots had been told that American bridges over the Danube were halting German retreats. They knew it was hopeless, but duty left no room for refusal. They never made it to the river. Near Ingolstadt, they flew into another wall of flak, unseen, unheard, instantaneous. Eyewitnesses described glowing fragments spiraling down through thin clouds, vanishing before hitting the ground. The 90mm crews never saw what they'd destroyed. They only logged altitude, bearing, and time, and waited for the radar to confirm no more contacts. It did. The sky went blank. Within a week, the Me-262s that survived were grounded permanently. Fuel was gone. Bases were overrun, and the invention that had once promised to restore German air dominance now lay scattered across airfields in twisted heaps of aluminum. Overhead, the smoke of victory drifted upward through empty air. Silent. Clean, unopposed when Germany surrendered in May 1945, thousands of Luftwaffe officers were marched into Allied custody. Among them were radar engineers, air defense specialists, and jet pilots. The best minds the Reich had left. Many expected to be questioned about the Me-262, the V-2, or their radar networks. Instead, the Americans asked something none of them understood. What do you know about proximity detonation? The interrogations revealed the scale of the German blind spot. Not a single captured officer had ever heard of a shell that could explode on its own near a target. Their laboratories had tinkered with acoustic and magnetic fuses, but the idea of a radio-triggered explosive brain small enough to survive artillery acceleration was beyond their reach. At one debriefing near Augsburg, a German radar officer was shown a disassembled VT fuse. Inside, he saw a tiny vacuum tube and a coiled antenna. He stared for a long time and finally whispered, "It is impossible that this worked." The American technician simply smiled. It worked every day. The statistics collected in the months following the campaign were staggering. In the European theater alone, 90mm gun batteries using VT ammunition recorded kill ratios up to 5 times higher than with conventional timed shells. Aircraft that once required hundreds of rounds to down were now destroyed with fewer than 10. Even more remarkable, the number of shells fired per target decreased dramatically, saving both logistics and manpower in a war already stretched to its limit. Analysts estimated that proximity fuses had shortened the war in Europe by 6 months, and in the Pacific by nearly a full year, a figure later echoed in official, post-war reports. The British Air Ministry called it the single most important improvement in artillery, efficiency since gunpowder. The U.S. Army's internal report used fewer words. Effect decisive. Secrecy that survived. Peace despite victory, the VT fuse remained classified for years. Even among Allied forces, few were allowed to know the details of its construction. Shells used in combat were collected, accounted for, and either reused or destroyed under supervision. The circuits were never shown publicly, and manufacturing diagrams stayed under lock and key at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Why the secrecy? Because the principle of the fuse applied far beyond anti-aircraft fire. It could trigger bombs, artillery shells, or depth charges with the same lethal precision. The Americans knew that in a future war, one likely to be fought with jet bombers and rockets, such technology would be priceless. At the start of the Cold War, the VT fuse's descendants quietly evolved into proximity warheads for surface-to-air missiles and nuclear-tipped interceptors. Its DNA lived on in weapons like the Nike, Talos, and even the early Sidewinder missiles, each using a variation of the same logic: emit, sense, detonate. The wartime shell had become the seed of modern guided warfare. The German realization, when Allied scientists toured captured German laboratories, they found an empire of advanced ideas. Swept wings, jet propulsion, rocket fuels, radar networks. But nowhere did they find a functioning proximity fuse. Their equivalents, the Zündschaltung für Nahdetonation projects, had failed early. German physicists lacked both the miniaturization techniques and the industrial capacity to build tubes small enough to survive artillery launch. At Peenemünde, investigators found early drawings for what looked like a radio fuse concept, but the prototypes were the size of thermos bottles and shattered on firing. The contrast was sobering. The Reich had produced the first jet, but the Allies had produced the first intelligent bullet, and that difference, small as it seemed, had tipped the balance of air power. Captured scientists later admitted their astonishment. One, Dr. Helmut Volkmann, reportedly said, "We believed we led in science. But this was science applied to the field faster than thought itself." The human legacy. For the gunners who fired the VT rounds, the end of the war came quietly. Most never knew they had been part of a top-secret revolution. They were farmers, mechanics, truck drivers, men who had loaded shells that changed physics without realizing it. When their batteries were decommissioned, the rounds were shipped away and replaced with standard ammunition. To them, the smart shell became just another rumor of wartime ingenuity. But in laboratories across the United States and Britain, the engineers who had created it continued their work. They moved into new fields: radar astronomy, missile defense, satellite guidance. Many of the same names that appeared on wartime VT patents would later appear in the early days of the space program. The brain that once guided a shell to an aircraft would soon guide a rocket to orbit. By the summer of 1945, the VT fuse's legacy was already expanding beyond destruction. It had proved something deeper, that the speed of computation could replace the instinct of men, that a circuit, if fast enough, could see, decide, and act faster than any soldier. The war had begun as a contest of courage. It ended as a contest of calculation. Even as Germany's ruins smoldered, the proximity fuse was already rewriting the final chapter of the Pacific War. By spring 1945, the U.S. Navy had unleashed it across the Pacific Fleet. From the Philippine Sea to Okinawa, the VT fuse turned anti-aircraft batteries into walls of light against the kamikaze storm. The Pacific Trial by fire in late March 1945. As the invasion of Okinawa began, the Japanese launched more than 1,500 kamikaze sorties, single-engine planes loaded with explosives, diving straight at destroyers and carriers. For months, sailors had dreaded those screaming dives, knowing their gunfire often came too late. But this time, the guns weren't guessing. Each 5-inch dual-purpose mount fired VT-fused shells that didn't wait to hit. They sensed the aircraft's approach and burst in mid-air, shredding wings and fuselages long before the dive could complete. Fleet reports described air walls, rings of instantaneous detonations forming hundreds of yards out from the ships. One captain wrote in his log, "We could see them die before they touched us. It was like watching time catch up to them." The Navy estimated that half of all kamikazes destroyed in the Okinawa campaign fell to VT-fused fire. On ships equipped with it, casualty rates dropped by nearly 70%. The weapon that had blinded German jets in Europe now shielded fleets half a world away. Admiral Chester Nimitz, in his post-war report, credited the fuse alongside radar and code-breaking as one of the 3 decisive technologies of victory. In the Pacific, it didn't just defend, it restored morale. Sailors began to believe again that technology could save lives faster than desperation could take them. A secret. Too powerful to share, when the war ended in August 1945, the proximity fuse's existence remained one of the best-kept secrets of the conflict. Commanders were ordered not to discuss it, even in debriefings. Public war bulletins mentioned improved fuses, but never said how they worked. Only after the atomic bombings did the Allies begin to acknowledge what they had built. President Truman personally approved the declassification of the fuse's general principle in late 1945. The public reaction was disbelief. Newspapers compared it to miniature radar brains and shells that think. In truth, it was not thought. It was precision born of physics. But the symbolism mattered. It proved that miniaturized electronics, not just brute force, had changed the destiny of modern war. From guns to missiles after the war, the lessons of the VT fuse became the backbone of Cold War weapons development. In the new race for air defense, the world had to stop something faster than jets: ballistic missiles. By the 1950s, engineers who had once built proximity fuses were now designing radar-guided interceptors. The Nike Ajax, America's first operational surface-to-air missile, carried an improved version of the same technology, a radio proximity fuse refined to detonate near supersonic targets. It was no longer a brain in a bullet. It was now the brain of a defense system. From there, the lineage spread everywhere. Every guided missile, from Patriot to Sidewinder, relied on the same concept: detect, compute, and detonate within lethal radius. Even space exploration inherited the logic. Satellites and probes used radar proximity sensors for docking, landing, and navigation. The idea, born in a wartime shell, had quietly become a universal law of engineering. Machines must sense before they act. When German scientists working under Operation Paperclip joined American labs after 1945, many were stunned to learn what had defeated them. They had built the first jet and the first ballistic missile, but not the first thinking fuse. They realized too late that miniaturization, not speed, had won the war of innovation. One German engineer summarized it bitterly: "We made the engines of the future. You made the trigger for it." The irony was profound. While Germany pursued breakthroughs in flight, America had learned to weaponize timing itself. It no longer mattered how fast an aircraft flew if the detonation could happen at the perfect instant. The laws of ballistics had met the logic of circuits, and the circuits had won. The human dimension. For decades, the proximity fuse remained invisible in public memory, overshadowed by flashier inventions like the atomic bomb or jet aircraft. Yet, to the soldiers, sailors, and engineers who used it, it carried a quieter legacy: precision as mercy. Crews at Okinawa remembered that the VT saved not only their ships but the pilots they never had to shoot down at close range. A well-timed burst meant a clean death in the sky, not fire on a deck. The invention that made killing efficient also made it distant, colder, and strangely humane by comparison. The engineers at Johns Hopkins later described the feeling of seeing their device in combat reports: pride mixed with unease. They had created a bridge between human reaction and machine autonomy, and once crossed, that bridge would never close again. When the first atomic tests began at Bikini Atoll, scientists used proximity sensors derived from VT designs to trigger detonations at precise altitudes. Even the dawn of the nuclear age depended on the fuse's timing logic. In a sense, the same tiny radio brain that had guarded a bridge in 1945 also measured the height of an atomic fireball a year later. From that moment forward, proximity fuses became the quiet foundation of deterrence itself, guiding interceptors, depth charges, warheads, and even spacecraft. They were everywhere, and yet invisible descendants of a weapon born in secrecy and proven in stormfire. By the end of the 20th century, no military system existed without the concept the VT fuse had pioneered: decision at the point of contact. In every radar-guided missile, every automated defense grid, every sensor that knows its surroundings. A trace of that wartime invention still. Lives. What began as a single line of radio pulse. Inside, a steel shell had grown into the nervous system of modern warfare, a logic that no longer needed a man at the trigger. When? The last guns fell silent in 1945. The men who had fired them went home, believing they had witnessed the end of an age. But history would later see it differently. The proximity fuse did more than win battles. It quietly rewired the relationship between human decision and mechanical action. Before it, war had always depended on the reflexes of people. A gunner judged by instinct. A pilot evaded by sight. Every shot carried the signature of human timing, hesitation, courage, luck. Then came the VT fuse. In that small metal cylinder, the spark of autonomy was born. It didn't wait for a man's command. It calculated its own. It didn't feel fear or pride or doubt, only distance and return. It was the first weapon to sense its target and act on that perception. For the first time in history, killing had been delegated to mathematics. That change slipped quietly into the bloodstream of civilization. What began as a radar echo in a shell became the logic of an age. Satellites measuring orbits, missiles judging proximity, machines making choices once reserved for human minds. The idea that a mechanism could detect, decide, and destroy in one loop had taken root. The 20th century would grow from it, for better and for worse. There's an old photograph from 1945, taken at an anti-aircraft site near Liège. A crew of young gunners stands beside a 90mm barrel, grinning, smoke curling around their helmets. They don't know that the round they've just fired represents a philosophical boundary crossed forever. They only know it worked. The rest, the automation, the age of guided missiles, the algorithms of war, would come later, carried forward by the same impulse that first told a shell when to explode. Looking back, it's easy to see the proximity fuse as just another piece of hardware in a vast machine of destruction. But its true meaning lies in what it foretold. A future where machines would share the burden of decision, where milliseconds would matter more than emotions, and where technology would outpace morality. The war ended. But the pulse of that fuse, that brief electric whisper in the sky, never stopped echoing. It was the sound of humanity teaching a weapon to think, and in doing so, teaching itself what it meant to be replaced by precision.